Have you ever watched America erase the island Iran built its whole economy on? I have. I'm Ryan, former F-15E Strike Eagle pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird, and right now I'm going to walk you through the strike that just changed this war. Because what happened at Kharg Island and along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz is unlike anything I've broken down for you before. Before I go any further, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who still think this conflict is stuck in a stalemate. And subscribe if this is your first time here, because we track every confirmed strike as the evidence comes in, not just the dramatic headlines everyone else recycles. Here's the roadmap for today. First, why Kharg Island and the Strait of Hormuz matter more than almost any other patch of ground or water on this entire planet. Second, the weapon itself, the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator, its first combat use in history, and why it represents a generational leap over everything America had before it. Third, the aircraft that delivered it, and what that tells us about where this campaign sits in its sequencing. Fourth, the strategic picture, what this means for global shipping, for oil markets, and for Iran's ability to hold the entire world hostage through a single waterway. And finally, my bottom line, as someone who has planned and flown strike packages built around exactly this kind of target. Let's start with the island itself, because I want you to actually understand what just got hit before I tell you how it got hit. Kharg Island sits about 25 kilometers off Iran's southwestern coast in the Persian Gulf, and it is, without exaggeration, the single most important piece of infrastructure Iran owns. Something like 90% of Iran's crude oil exports move through Kharg Island's terminals. Not 90% of a region, not 90% of one pipeline. 90% of the entire country's ability to sell oil to the outside world runs through storage tanks and loading berths sitting on a slab of rock roughly 8 kilometers long. Iran built that dependency on purpose decades ago, because Kharg was supposed to be defensible, close enough to the mainland for air cover, ringed by air defense batteries, protected by naval patrols, ringed further out by the exact kind of hardened coastal missile sites I've told you about before. For years, that assumption held. Then came the early hours of the strike I'm about to walk you through, and everything Iran believed about that island's safety fell apart in the space of a single mission package. Let me back up and give you the full picture, because the Kharg Island strike doesn't make sense in isolation. It only makes sense once you understand the Strait of Hormuz itself. The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20% of the world's crude oil passes through it every single day. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to read past it. Not 20% of a region's oil supply. Not 20% of one country's exports. 20% of the entire planet's crude oil moves through a waterway that, at its narrowest, is barely wider than the distance I could fly in a fighter jet in about 90 seconds. Iran has known this for decades. And for decades, Iran built an entire military doctrine around one core idea. If we can threaten the strait, we can threaten every economy on Earth that depends on oil. That doctrine has a name: anti-access area denial, A2AD in the business. The concept is simple and, frankly, elegant if you're the one holding the leverage. You don't need to defeat the US Navy in a straight fight. You just need to make the water dangerous enough that commercial shipping stops, insurance premiums make transit economically impossible, and global pressure to end hostilities shifts in your favor. The weapon Iran chose to anchor that strategy: anti-ship cruise missiles, hardened, dug into the coastline, built to survive a conventional air attack. By the time Operation Epic Fury launched at 1:15 a.m. on February 28, 2026, Iran had positioned those missiles inside purpose-built reinforced sites carved directly into rock along its southern coast. Not improvised shelters, not sand berms thrown up overnight. Hardened, reinforced structures specifically engineered to survive anything short of America's most powerful conventional weapons. And the effect was already being felt before a single GBU-72 ever left a weapons bay. By early March, commercial shipping through the strait had ground to a near halt. Roughly 20 vessels had already been attacked in the area. Oil markets were moving in real time. Tanker crews were making the kind of decisions no civilian mariner should ever have to make, whether the paycheck was worth the water they were sailing into. The world's most important oil chokepoint was effectively being held hostage by a country that could not have won a conventional naval war against the ships it was threatening. That is the exact problem the GBU-72 was built to solve. And on March 17, 2026, it solved it for the first time in combat history. Now let me actually explain this weapon, because I don't think most coverage of this strike does it justice. The GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator is a 5000LB precision-guided munition, official designation GBU-72/B, and its development began back in 2017 as part of a broader effort to modernize American bunker penetration capability against exactly the kind of hardened coastal and underground targets that Iran and other adversaries have spent billions of dollars building. Development testing wrapped up in 2021 at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The 96th Test Wing conducted the first release, a milestone that confirmed the weapon could be safely integrated onto operational aircraft, and it was cleared for combat use later that same year. For nearly 5 years after that, it sat in the inventory, tested, validated, ready, waiting for a target set that actually justified using it. March 17th, 2026 was the day that wait ended. Here's why this weapon is different from what came before it, and the difference genuinely matters. The GBU-58 has been in service since 1991, born out of the Gulf War when planners realized they needed something capable of punching through Iraqi hardened aircraft shelters. For 35 years, the GBU-28 was America's answer to buried and hardened targets in the 5000LB weight class. The problem is that every adversary on Earth had 35 years to study the GBU-28 and build against it. They dug their bunkers deeper. They reinforced their ceilings. They layered concrete and rock specifically engineered to defeat a weapon whose characteristics had become public knowledge. The GBU-72 is the answer to all of that patient counter-engineering. Its warhead and casing were designed from scratch using advanced modeling and simulation, not adapted from an old airframe, built from the ground up for the threat environment that actually exists today. The steel casing is hardened to punch through reinforced concrete and rock before the warhead ever detonates. It uses GPS guidance for precision delivery. This is not a dumb bomb dropped in the general vicinity and hoped for. It is a guided weapon that hits exactly where it's aimed. The key technical detail is what the Pentagon calls post-penetration detonation, meaning the weapon punches through the target structure first, travels through the material, reaches the interior space, and only then does the warhead go off. I want to explain why that distinction matters operationally, because it's easy to gloss over on a highlight reel. A bomb that detonates on surface impact creates a big, dramatic surface explosion, a huge fireball, a satisfying shockwave, great footage for state media to loop. But the hardened structure underneath survives. The roof absorbs the blast. The walls contain it. The people and equipment inside are shaken, maybe damaged, but still functional the next morning. A bomb that punches through the roof, travels down into the enclosed space, and detonates from the inside. That's a categorically different weapon. The explosion happens inside a sealed room with nowhere for the shockwave to go. It reflects off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It amplifies on itself. It collapses the structure from within rather than scarring the surface above it. That is what the GBU-72 does. And according to Air Force statements, its lethality against deeply buried and fortified targets is substantially higher than the GBU-28 it's replacing. I want to be transparent about what we actually know here versus what's still unconfirmed. CENTCOM confirmed the strikes were successfully conducted. CENTCOM confirmed multiple GBU-72 weapons were employed against hardened coastal missile sites, and separately against the terminal infrastructure on Kharg Island itself. The Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Dan Kane, confirmed the weapon publicly at a Pentagon briefing alongside Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. What has not been publicly released is a detailed site-by-site battle damage assessment. I'm not going to overstate what's confirmed, and neither should anyone else covering this. What I will tell you, from having planned strike packages like this myself, is that you do not follow up an earlier strike with a more capable, more expensive weapon against hardened targets if the earlier strikes were already achieving the desired effect. The choice to bring in the GBU-72 tells you everything about how hardened these particular targets actually were. Now let's talk about the aircraft, because this part gets overlooked constantly, and it shouldn't. The GBU-72 was integrated onto 2 confirmed platforms before its combat debut, the F-15E Strike Eagle and the B-1B Lancer. I flew the F-15E. I know this jet from the inside of the cockpit, not from a spec sheet. The Strike Eagle is a dual-role fighter bomber, one of the most capable strike platforms ever built, with precision targeting systems, electronic countermeasures, a diverse weapons load, and real speed, close to Mach 2.5 at the top end. It can ingress fast, deliver a precision weapon, and egress before a degraded but not fully eliminated air defense system can generate a valid fire solution, something a large bomber cannot replicate. The B-2 and B-52 are extraordinary platforms, but they are not fighters. And putting a 5000LB bunker-busting weapon on a fighter changes the entire operational picture, More sorties, more flexibility, the ability to task a package against multiple hardened sites and an island terminal complex in a single night instead of routing a handful of heavy bombers through one target area at a time. The B-1B Lancer, the Bone, adds a different layer, a significant internal payload of precision-guided munitions and a lower radar cross-section than the B-52. Photos from 2024 testing already confirmed the GBU-72 being carried externally on the B-1B, a meaningful integration step. Whether the March 17th strikes on the coastal sites and on Kharg were flown by F-15Es, B-1Bs, or a mix of both hasn't been specified by CENTCOM. What has been confirmed is that multiple weapons were delivered successfully against multiple hardened sites, and that the terminal infrastructure on Kharg absorbed direct hits severe enough that satellite imagery reviewed afterward showed entire sections of the loading platform gone, not damaged, gone. Let me give you the operational sequencing context, because this is where my own background is actually useful instead of just decorative. Operation Epic Fury launched at 1:15 a.m. on February 28, 2026. In the first 72 hours, U.S. forces struck over 1,700 targets across Iran. Sit with that number. 1,700 targets in 72 hours is a strike rate that requires B-1 bombers, B-2 stealth bombers, B-52S, carrier-based fighters, land-based F-15S, F-16S, F-18S, F-22S, F-35S, A-10s, electronic attack aircraft, and a layered command and control architecture operating simultaneously across an entire country. The opening phase used the heaviest weapons in the American inventory. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000 LB bomb only the B-2 Spirit can carry, was employed against Iran's deeply buried nuclear facilities, including the Fordow fuel enrichment plant. Fordow was built inside a mountain, not near one, inside it, because Iran specifically chose that location and construction method so the facility could survive a conventional air attack. The GBU-57 is the reason that calculus is no longer valid. Here's the sequencing piece I really want you to understand. In the opening hours of a campaign against an adversary with a capable air defense network, and Iran had one, you do not send fighters over the target first. You send the low observable platforms. You send the B-2 first because it can penetrate an intact air defense network in ways non-stealth aircraft simply cannot. You use those opening strikes to hit the air defense infrastructure itself, the radar systems, the command nodes, the integrated network, what we call seed and deed in the business, suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses. Once those defenses are degraded, the threat environment changes completely. What was a valid shot at a non-stealth aircraft on night one becomes a much harder problem for an adversary with no radar, no command links, no integrated response. That changed environment is exactly when you bring in the fighters. That's when you can task a package of F-15Es with GBU-72S against hardened coastal missile sites, and eventually against the terminal complex on Kharg Island itself, and accept a level of risk that would have been operationally reckless on night one. The fact that the GBU-72 made its combat debut on March 17th, nearly 3 weeks into the operation, is not a coincidence. It's a deliberate campaign sequencing decision, the right weapon on the right target at the right point in the timeline, exactly how this kind of operation is supposed to be planned. Now let's go back to Kharg, because I promised you I'd explain why an island most Americans have never heard of just became the most consequential piece of real estate in this entire war. Picture the geography for a second. Narrow strip of rock in the Persian Gulf, tanker berths stretching out into open water, storage tanks lined up in rows like a small city built entirely out of steel, pipelines running underneath everything connecting the island back to Iran's onshore fields. For decades, this was Iran's crown jewel, its financial lifeline, the single choke point through which almost the entire national economy had to pass to reach a buyer anywhere in the world. Strategists inside Tehran knew that a direct strike on Kharg would be treated as an act of economic war on a scale Iran had never actually experienced, and for years that assumption bought the island a kind of unofficial immunity, an understanding that even in a shooting war, some targets were simply too catastrophic to touch. That assumption is gone now. When the GBU-72 sorties reached Kharg, they weren't targeting a single storage tank or a single pipeline junction. They were targeting the hardened control infrastructure that keeps the entire terminal functioning as one coordinated system, the reinforced pumping stations, the fortified loading control centers, the exact kind of structures Iran had specifically hardened because planners in Tehran assumed a 2000 LB JDAM could never reach deep enough to matter. They were wrong. Satellite imagery reviewed in the hours afterward showed smoke columns visible from commercial flight paths miles away, an entire corner of the terminal complex reduced to twisted steel and scorched concrete, and for the first time since Kharg's terminals were built, loading operations across the island stopped completely. Not slowed, not rationed, stopped. I want to pause here and give you something you won't get from a headline. I spent years flying strike missions where the target folder listed a grid coordinate and a structure type, and it's easy at 400 knots to think about the mission purely as a weapons employment problem. It's only afterward, in the debrief, that the human scale settles in. Somewhere on that island were technicians running pump controls, security personnel walking a perimeter, workers who showed up for a normal shift with no idea they were reporting to what had just become one of the most heavily targeted pieces of infrastructure on the planet. That weight sits underneath every one of these strikes, and it deserves to be acknowledged honestly, not buried under acronyms. Now let me address the strait itself directly, because the strategic stakes here are bigger than most people watching this actually realize. Iran's coastal anti-ship cruise missiles were never just military hardware. They were economic weapons with global reach, and Kharg was the physical embodiment of exactly how much leverage a single stretch of coastline can hold. 20% of the world's crude oil, every tanker transiting the strait a potential target, every insurance underwriter from London to Singapore recalculating risk the moment Iran proved it was willing and able to hit commercial shipping. By early March, the effect was already visible everywhere. Traffic stalled, oil markets reacting in real time, supply chains rerouted, countries dependent on Gulf oil drafting contingency plans. The GBU-72 strikes on March 17th were a direct attempt to change that equation by destroying the hardened coastal sites and the terminal infrastructure on Kharg, not suppressing them, destroying the physical capability to project that leverage at all. Whether that objective is being fully achieved is something I'll keep tracking, but strategically the intent could not be clearer. There's one more piece of this story worth knowing. The Air Force awarded Boeing a new contract in February 2026, confirmed in a publicly released justification notice to produce additional GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator bombs, replacing inventory expended during the June 2025 Operation Midnight Hammer strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, and it's already exploring a next-generation penetrator, the NGP, meant to eventually replace the GBU-57 entirely. That's not the posture of a military treating this as a one-off campaign. It's the posture of one that sees hardened underground and coastal targets as a persistent, long-term problem, not just in Iran, but in every country that watched an island terminal complex go dark in a single night and is now quietly reassessing its own hardened infrastructure. Other governments are studying these strikes right now with real attention, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about which ones. My bottom line, and I want to be direct about all three pieces of it. First, this closes a capability gap that existed for a full generation. The GBU-28 has been in service since 1991, and its replacement finally entered combat 35 years later against exactly the category of hardened target it was built to defeat. That's a major milestone for American precision strike capability overall, not just for this specific campaign. Second, the combat debut of a previously untested weapon in a major operational context, used against both dispersed coastal sites and a single high-value island terminal, signals something important. The U.S. is not holding its newest conventional munitions in reserve for some hypothetical future conflict. It's proving them in combat against real hardened targets with real operational stakes. And every adversary that has invested heavily in hardened infrastructure just had to update its threat assessment overnight. Third, the target set tells you everything about where this campaign's priorities sit right now. These were never nuclear targets or command nodes. These were anti-ship cruise missile positions and, ultimately, the single most important piece of oil export infrastructure Iran owns, which tells you this phase of the operation is specifically focused on reopening international shipping lanes and stripping away Iran's ability to leverage the choke point economically. Whether that's working and what comes after Kharg is exactly what I'll keep covering. Here's what I want from you in the comments. If you were the air component commander planning the next phase of this campaign, what would you be most worried about? Iran still has truck-mounted mobile missile launchers that are difficult to distinguish from civilian traffic. It still has dispersed munitions, stockpiles built specifically to survive a fixed-site strike. It has a documented history of reconstituting faster than analysts expect. What do you think the hardest target set left on the board actually looks like? Drop your answer below. I read every single one, and it genuinely shapes what I dig into next. If you want to understand how the GBU-72 fits into the full weapons hierarchy, where the GBU-57 sits above it, why the B-2 Spirit remains the only platform that can carry the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, and what it means that the Air Force is already replacing that inventory while developing its successor, I break all of that down in the next video. So hit subscribe now so you don't miss it. There's one more thing worth sitting with before I let you go. The Strait of Hormuz, and Kharg Island specifically, aren't just an Iranian problem. They're a global governance problem. Freedom of navigation, the right of commercial vessels to transit international straits without being held hostage by a single coastal state, is one of the foundational norms of the entire modern international order. When that norm gets violated by state-sponsored military action against commercial shipping, it doesn't just affect the countries directly involved. It affects every maritime nation on the planet that depends on those same sea lanes staying open. The US strikes on Iran's coastal missile infrastructure, and ultimately on the terminal complex at Kharg, are in one framing a kinetic enforcement of that principle, not just declared in a diplomatic statement, not just condemned after the fact, but enforced with precision-guided munitions against the exact